exhausted and busy. So we appreciate your joining us. I'm Professor Yael Aronoff. I direct the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel at MSU, and I'm a professor of international relations and Sterling Chair of Israel Studies also at James Madison College. And I'm very, very honored to also introduce my colleague and friend. This was just very quickly about me too. I've published The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers When Hardliners Opt for Peace, and co-edited with Dr. Saliba Sarsar and Ilan Peleg, Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel Beyond, and have published in a variety of different edited books and journals. But I think more impressive is my friend and colleague of many years, Dr. Saliba Sarsar, who was born and raised in Jerusalem. He's professor of political science at Monmouth University and president and CEO of the Jerusalem Peace Institute. During 2022 to 2024, he's also a visiting research collaborator at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. His teaching and scholarly interests focus on the Middle East, Palestinian and Israeli affairs, Jerusalem, and peace building. Dr. Sarsar's most recent authored books are Peace Building in Israeli-Palestinian Relations and Jerusalem, The Home in Our Hearts. His most recent edited books are The Holy Land Confederation as a Facilitator for the Two-State Solution and What Jerusalem Means to Us, Christian Perspectives and Reflections. He's also co-edited books are Inequality and Governance in an Uncertain World, What Jerusalem Means to Us, Jewish Perspectives and Reflections, What Jerusalem Means to Us, Muslim Perspectives and Reflections, Democracy and Crisis Around the World, and the edited book that I just mentioned on Continuity and Change, Political Culture. He's been featured in several publications, including the New York Times, and is the recipient of many awards, including the Award of Academic Excellence from the American Task Force on Palestine, the Global Visionary, the Stafford Presidential Award of Excellence, and the Eugene Simcoe Faculty Leadership Award from Monmouth University, as well as Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice, among many others. So we're really privileged to have Dr. Sarsar with us. He was with us on October 10th in person at MSU for a panel we had about what Jerusalem means to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and future visions for Jerusalem. And he was also in person at MSU a year ago, where we had invited several Israelis and Palestinians to talk about confederation based on a two-state solution for a future vision. So we're really honored to have you again, and really honored for you to join us.
Thank you very much, Yael. I'm honored to be with you.
Thank you. So thank you for joining us for this webinar on and, not or, empathetic complexity, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and efforts to resolve it. We'd briefly like to thank our co-sponsors, College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, the Residential Colleges of Arts and Humanities, the International Studies and Programs, the Office for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, and the Asian Studies Center. So it is a time when many of us are in a lot of pain. It's been a very painful time over the past, I don't know, it's been 54 days or so. But it's also a time when we want to promote mutual compassion and empathy for all Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians who have been killed or have been taken hostage. We organized, Dr. Sarsar and I organized this webinar because we wanted to present an alternative to the polarized atmosphere in which many students feel that they either have to be pro-Palestine or pro-Israel, when people can be pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and pro-peace. We reject an either-or a framework and rather use a framework that honors the legitimacy of both Israeli and Palestinian desires for self-determination, promotes trying to understand Israeli and Palestinian perspectives with compassion, recognizes previous efforts to negotiate peace and looks to future possibilities for negotiating peace through a two-state solution or a confederation based on a two-state solution. Many students, I think, get their information or some of their information and sometimes disinformation through social media, which can promote oversimplification and polarization. So as students search for more information, We want to provide an academic understanding and offer an opportunity for both of us to answer questions. So I'll speak for up to 20 minutes. Dr. Sarsar will speak for up to 20 minutes, and he will speak on previous attempts to negotiate peace and future possibilities to get to a peace agreement. And then we'll open it up to your questions in the Q&A. That Ariana Metzel, there's so many people. I know there were 350 people registered, and there are almost already 200 people on now. So we may get many questions. And so she's going to sift through them, try to combine some questions, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can and try to leave a lot of time for the Q&A. So our own talks will not focus on October 7th and the war since then, but we're happy to answer questions from the audience about that and fully understand that that's been on a lot of our minds. One reason we decided to leave the latter to Q&A is because we want to show how the either or thinking can shape how one interprets and understands current events, and how current events are then used to interpret past events. So the either or framework has several weaknesses. It lends itself to selectively choosing information that only supports one side and tends to demonize the other. As members of a university community, we know that when writing our own papers, we don't want to ignore information that disconfirms our hypotheses or assumptions, and only select and dismiss information that doesn't conform to that. And we also, in the field of psychology, know that we're all prone to try to avoid cognitive dissonance. And so we want all of our interpretations to align without any complications, complexity, or exceptions, so as not to allow cognitive dissonance with our assumptions. An either or framework also tends towards oversimplification, tends to promote kind of uncritical understanding of one side only, tends to treat a side as monolithic, and tends to view one side alone as the sole victim. In order to move towards peace, there needs to be mutual compassion, mutual legitimacy, and an emphasis on moving forward constructively. So I'm going to use some examples, and I'm doing this very quickly, so there are many things that I'm leaving out as examples of how this framework can be used looking at historically. So that it's not either Palestinians, for instance, are indigenous or Jews are indigenous, but rather it's Palestinians are indigenous and Jews are indigenous. Palestinian nationalism is rooted in indigeneity and is legitimate, as is Jewish desires for self-determination that are rooted in its indigeneity. So, you know, really quickly, if you go to the Torah and Josephus, as well as modern scholarship and archaeology, you might see that under King David, there's sovereignty in the 9th century BCE. King Solomon built the first temple. The temple stood for 410 years before it was destroyed by Babylonians. And then the second temple was built, and until the Babylonian exile in 350 BC, and it stood for 420 years until it was destroyed in 70 CE when it was destroyed by the Romans. So Jews have carried that memory and desire to return home in daily prayers and many rituals and holidays. And many lived there continuously, where many others had been expelled. Many of those expelled were expelled to countries all over the Middle East, where they had lived for hundreds of years, until many were forced out after the establishment of Israel and came to Israel. So there's a strong indigenous Palestinian connection, but there's also an indigenous Jewish connection, and we can honor and try to understand and have compassion and hold those simultaneously in our hearts. Another example would be looking at the 1948 war, as not one narrative or another is true, but rather parts of narratives are both true. So it's true that yesterday was the 76th anniversary of the approval by the UN General Assembly of the 1947 partition plan, where the UN voted for a Jewish and Arab state, which was accepted by the Jewish Zionists and rejected by the Palestinian leadership. I think one can also try to understand why it was rejected by the Palestinian leadership, but nevertheless, there was some legitimacy granted to the establishment of a Jewish state by the United Nations. And then, so part of this narrative that we want to have compassion for is that then the Jews, many who were refugees themselves, were attacked by four strong state militaries, as well as some Palestinian militias, with intent at best to conquer and expel, and at worst to massacre the Jews had they lost the 1948 war, in attempt among some of those states to aggrandize those states. And it is true that during the war, some Israeli military commanders forced out approximately 150,000 Palestinians, an additional 600,000 left during the Nakba or catastrophe for Palestinians. And those people who left didn't just leave because one day they felt like leaving, but rather there was a large war going on. They thought they would win the war and would be able to come back in 2 weeks. And it was a huge Nakba catastrophe for Jews and for Palestinians. And so you can hold both things to be simultaneously true, that it would have been a catastrophe for Jews had they lost, and that it was a catastrophe for Palestinians in the 48 war. Of course, some stayed and became 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinians within the 67 borders. And so when I think we're trying to get others to put themselves in both Palestinian shoes and empathize with the Nakba of 1948, and also in Jewish Israeli shoes, and understand that it would have been a Nakba for them had they lost the war. If we kind of jump ahead and look to the 67 war, we can do some of this kind of and thinking as well to be compassionate for both people. So on one hand, we can say Israel didn't want the war. They tried to avert it. They feared massacres and dug mass graves in case they would have lost the war. They warned Jordan not to attack West Jerusalem. And when it did, and it's a longer story why that happened, then they took over East Jerusalem. During Jordanian rule, Jews weren't allowed to enter the Old City or pray in the Old City, and the Jewish quarter was destroyed. And after the 67 war, they offered the West Bank to Jordan for peace, the Gaza Strip and Sinai to Egypt for peace, and the Golan to Syria for peace. And at that time, the Arab League said no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiations with Israel, and no to land for peace deals with Israel. So that is true to try to understand and empathize with Israelis. And it is also true to put oneself in Palestinian shoes, that once Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza Strip, in this case as well, that then they lived under and suffered under occupation and are still suffering under occupation in the West Bank. Israel withdrew its soldiers and settlers in 2005 from the Gaza Strip, but there still continues to be much Palestinian suffering who don't yet have an independent Palestinian state. And we can put ourselves, I think through empathetically, and that doesn't mean that there's equal power or there's equal degrees of blame for different things, but to try to look at both peoples in a compassionate way. There have been serious efforts to end the occupation since 1967. And so we've had several, we had the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Fatah Party starting in 1988, more officially, saying that they no longer have the goal of destroying Israel and having a Palestinian state instead of Israel, and no longer would have tactics of targeting civilians in order to create possibilities for a Palestinian state next to an Israeli state. And we had the ensuing Oslo negotiations between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, where both recognized each other, and you had progress made toward getting to a peace process and the structures of a Palestinian government in the West Bank. And in the aftermath of that, you had several Israeli governments, including, Rabin was voted on a mandate for peace and reaching peace with the Palestinians, as was Ehud Barak then, and in 2000, and where he had serious negotiations in 2000, 2001, and Ehud Olmert in 2008. made serious efforts, and we've had, thousands of hours of negotiations over many years, and I think Dr. Sarsar will talk more about that, to reach a two-state solution. And in 2008, that mainly entailed Israel having most of East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, and 94% of the West Bank, with a connection between the West Bank and Gaza, going to a new Palestinian state, with the remaining 6% that they were keeping come from territory from pre-1967 Israel that would be going to a Palestinian state, with some shared multilateral also jurisdiction of sites in the Old City as well. And so much progress was made to envisioning two states. And there were progress that was made both on part of Mahmoud Abbas and negotiators like Saliba Sarsar, and Israeli prime ministers, initially like Rabin, and then Barak, and then Olmert in some ways. It is true in this and framework that we had spoilers on both Palestinian and Israeli sides. And often they strengthened each other. They both opposed a two-state solution. And there were some on the Palestinian side and some on the Israeli side who wanted one state in which they saw themselves dominating, and that would be kind of provide legitimacy essentially to one people's idea for self-determination and legitimacy, as opposed to both peoples. So on one side, you had a party like Hamas, that was created in the 1980s, but during the 1990s and the Oslo period, they had intentional suicide bombings against civilians, partially to reject progress in the Oslo process and the two-state solution. That led and influenced Netanyahu getting elected in 1996 for the first time by a very narrow margin, because of the fears that were created and the trust that was undermined by those things. And likewise, then his party, which traditionally the Likud party, had also opposed a two-state solution. And he and others since then have obstructed progress through continued settlements in the West Bank and other measures that solidified rather than untangled the occupation in the West Bank. And you see that happening again in the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2005, where again, not only, but groups like Hamas had suicide bombings at a weekly basis often, which undermined the trust in the vision for destroying Israel and having one Palestinian state in the entire territory. And likewise, it's strengthening then the right in Israel, who then thought were disillusioned and fearful of there being a partner for peace, and therefore undermined kind of the center-left in Israel and strengthened the right in Israel to the extent where today's government is the most right that Israel's had. And so you can see this as a kind of conditions and history for which you've had both partners for peace through serious negotiations that have been tried, and simultaneously spoilers on both sides that have tried to undermine that progress and have created disillusionment among both Israelis and Palestinians in terms of the short-term, at least, prospects for peace. We also simultaneously have, despite all the violence that had occurred when there was a stagnation in the peace process, we've had a plurality of Israelis and Palestinians, often in surveys, saying that they still prefer a two-state solution to any other single solution. And so you still have some hopes for progress being made in the future, but often a disillusionment by Israelis that Palestinians are serious because of groups like Hamas that have targeted civilians and have wanted at times to destroy Israel. And you have Palestinians saying, well, we do it, but Israel is reneging on this by continuing settlements in the West Bank and its current government, especially drawing a lot of obstacles to trying to get to a two-state solution. So I think this framework, as opposed to the or framework, helps us better understand even the current moment and invites us to have compassion for and critique, but not dehumanize Israelis and Palestinians. So there's so much more to say, but we're trying to keep a lot of time for Q&A that might also surround more questions in the last couple months. And it's always an honor, and I think it'll be a privilege once you hear him, to hear from Dr. Saliba Sarsar. So thanks for joining us, Saliba, and I always look forward to hearing from you and learning from you. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Yael. It's tremendous to hear your voice and have the image of the and instead of the or, because we have been divided for so long, and it is time for us to say enough is enough. We need to move forward together. And if we can agree as two scholars, two human beings, why cannot the others in Israel-Palestine agree as well? What I want to address is the issue of breaking the deadlock in Israeli-Palestinian relations. And just to let you know that Israeli-Palestinian relations are at a crucial juncture. 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of the 48 war, the 56th anniversary of the June 67 war, the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords of September 93. And we see that after years of diplomatic inertia, extremism, and ultra-nationalism are on the rise, with violence often spiraling out of control, as expressed with what we are going through in terms of the Israel-Hamas war that resulted from the terroristic Hamas attack on October 7th. The status quo is untenable. Much is at stake, and indecision is costly for all concerned. I know it is extremely hard for us to think of the future during tragedy, trauma, and hopelessness, but we must try if we want to exit from the valley of death and welcome ourselves to the bright light of the future. Israelis and Palestinians have become victims of their own exclusive national narratives, the or type, and are speaking past each other. Many on each side are unable to go beyond the zero-sum game and the zero-sum mentality. They selectively highlight the rightness of their own cause, accuse the other side of bad intentions or misconduct, and fail to realize that how their own rhetoric and acts cause aggressive and aggravating conditions. The outcomes have been negative, mainly extremism, exclusion, past claims and counterclaims, and the lack of a consistent vision for a peaceful horizon. These have led to hatred, cruelty, murder, and untold pain and suffering. It has also weaponized religion in pursuit of ideological, religious, and political goals, which has caused a lot of bloodshed, as we are witnessing. An alternative future is required from both Israelis and Palestinians, where they feel secure at home. As Joel Rosenthal, president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, stated, "We get there by reaffirming the equal moral worth of every human being, the duty to protect the innocent, and a commitment to empathy as a matter of both morality and enlightened self-interest." In this context, it is worth remembering the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who stated, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction." And so we understand, and it's clear to everybody, that the obstacles in the way of progress towards peace are numerous and real. There is a power asymmetry, a power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians. There is a one-state reality with Israel dominant over the Palestinians. There is hardening of attitudes in Israel and Palestine. There is relative weakness of the Israeli and Palestinian peace camps. There is Israeli settler radicalization. There is Palestinian anti-normalization campaign. There is, yes, terrorism. But these must not delay or prevent the search for opportunities and positive outcomes. In this regard, simple facts present themselves. First, Israelis and Palestinians are neighbors forever. Their present and future are intertwined, whether they acknowledge this reality or not. Second, the longer Israelis and Palestinians wait to negotiate, the more complex the issues will become, and the less room there will be for a peaceful solution. Third, the core issues that separate Israelis and Palestinians, such as borders, the separation wall, security, Israeli settlements, Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, water, are all well known and thoroughly debated and resolvable. The challenge is to initiate negotiations and negotiate in good faith. Fourth, the inclusion of regional and international actors becomes key, as peace requires assurances, follow-up, and support to take root and to grow. Fifth, while peace is ultimately in the hands of Israelis and Palestinians, the United States can do much to move the process forward. It is indispensable for the promotion and sustenance of peace negotiations. The prerequisite for peacemaking for me is peace from the top versus peace building from the bottom. The prerequisites for peacemaking, such as context and timing, leadership and political will, societal strength and resilience, process, content and creativity, all of these are known. U.S. diplomacy must be credible, intentional, and sustained. It must be transformative. This comprises not only making peace a priority, but also acting accordingly. It's not enough for the President of the United States and Secretary of State to talk about it. They need to start acting on it and implementing it. The situation on the ground must change. A realistic plan and process of peacemaking must be launched, and Israelis and Palestinians must be held accountable for their actions and inactions. The strategic interest of Egypt and Jordan that have peace treaties with Israel, of Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan that are party to the Abraham Accords, and of Saudi Arabia that is entertaining normalized relations with Israel, should impel them to motivate Palestinians to make hard decisions for an end to conflict and peace. Israel needs to reciprocate. Circumventing the Palestinian issue or wishing it away will not advance Israel's strategic goals, especially in the long run. Initiating unilateral moves and thinking of the Palestinian issue as a security matter only, without addressing its political and territorial dimensions, will not enhance Israel's defense. If anything, they will continue to rile the Palestinians, particularly the youth among them, and could potentially lead to more bloodshed. Israel and Palestine and their respective supporters should realize that maximal nationalist demands of full dominance by one over the other, or the incorporation of both Israelis and Palestinians in a single democratic state at this time, no matter how attractive it is, will only lead to a dead end. Peace necessitates that both Israel and Palestine do their best and judiciously expect less than they hope for. The two-state solution has been the official United States policy since 2002, even though many think of it as non-operative or less viable today. It is the one plan that will give security to Israel and independence to the Palestinian people. The US should urge Israel and the Palestinians to put on their agenda the idea of confederation, which adjusts or introduces important modifications to the two-state solution. If properly implemented, confederation would enable Palestinians to advance their search for freedom, sovereignty, and statehood without being anti-Israel, and it would enable Israelis to have their security and well-being without being anti-Palestinian. The deadlock in Israeli-Palestinian relations must be broken. If peace negotiations are any indication, there is middle ground between the positions of Israel and the Palestinians. The United States possesses the essential capabilities to move both negotiating parties to take the necessary political risk by compromising and engaging in unavoidable trade-offs on the path to peace. Now, you might ask me, and it's a very good question that I'm posing now, what hope do you have? How come you are hopeful? I am really somewhat pessimistic in the near future, but I'm really hopeful for the long run. And I use examples, including the one of Sadat, the one of Hussein, and the one of Itzhak Rabin. Sadat, who was not in favor of Israel by any means, felt the defeat of 1967 when he became president after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser. He wanted to regain the territories that were lost by Egypt, as well as other surrounding Arab countries. And he initiated a surprise attack against Israel on October the 6th, 1973, together with Syria. And they proved that they could do it at the start of the war. They could surprise and achieve some wins, even though Egypt lost the war, yet that was an important declaration, an important expression of a will to overcome the past. And the United States at the time was too busy in Vietnam, but this war alerted the United States about the seriousness of what was going to happen. And so Sadat was willing after that war to go the extra mile to reach to the land of his enemy, to reach to Israel. And so he signed in 1974 the first disengagement agreement. Then he signed the second disengagement agreement, which is referred to as Sinai II, in which he declared there shall be no more war between Egypt and Israel. And to the surprise of the world, on November the 19th, 1977, he visited Israel. He spoke in front of the parliament, committing to no more wars between Egypt and Israel. The year later, in 78, he went to Camp David at the invitation of Jimmy Carter, and he met with Menachem Begin, who was not really in any way supportive of the Arab people. His whole life he devoted to Israeli dominance and security and so on. And yet both of them, coming from opposite sides of the divide, found enough in common to negotiate. And President Carter, whose wife Rosalind, by the way, passed away, and she will be, she was honored tremendously yesterday. and I mention her intentionally, Rosalind Carter, because she was party to the Camp David negotiation and influencing her husband. And President Carter insisted to be very active in those negotiations. And at one point, Anwar Sadat threatened to leave the negotiations, and Carter told him, if you leave these grounds, you are no longer my friend. This is the type of leadership we need at this moment to say enough is enough. We want to overcome what is dividing both Palestinians and Israelis. And the point I'm making here is that 6 months after the Camp David Accords, there is the Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty of 1979. Unfortunately and tragically, Anwar Sadat was assassinated on October 6, 1981. And this is the courage that he had, even though the Arab countries around him berated him and boycotted Egypt and so on. People came around to realize that he dared, and he was a hero of peace, bringing the end of war between him, that is Egypt, and Israel. Now, in terms of King Hussein, very important figure for many, many years, from the early 50s until his passing in the late 1990s. And I remember as a young, as a child, as an 11-year-old boy, the Six-Day War began. And on June the 5th, you could hear the voice of King Hussein, who asked his citizens to fight the enemy, the Israelis that is, wherever you find them. But close to his deathbed, he pleaded for peace during the Wye River Middle East Conference. At the signing of the resultant Wye Memorandum in Washington, D.C. on October 23rd, 1998, he said, and if you'll allow me, I would like to quote, he said, "We quarrel, we agree, we are friendly, we are not friendly, but we have no right to dictate through irresponsible action or narrow-mindedness the future of our children and their children's children. There has been enough destruction, enough death, enough waste, and it's time that we together occupy a place beyond ourselves, not out peoples that is worthy of them under the sun, the descendants of the children of Abraham." We come to the third and last example from Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who dedicated his life, by the way, to the defense and security of Israel, and who fought hard against Palestinians, such as during the First Intifada. He had a change of heart in his Knesset, Israeli Parliament speech on September 21st, 1993. 8 days after signing the Oslo Accords at the White House lawn, he stated, "The government has decided to try to put an end to hatred in order that our children and grandchildren will not experience the painful price of wars, terrorism, and violence. This government has decided to safeguard their lives and security, to ease the sorrow and the painful memories, to pray and hope for peace." Unfortunately, like Sadat, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated on November the 4th, 1995 by a right-wing religious settler fanatic Israeli. And this is a lesson that we need to know, that heroes of peace sometimes get assassinated, but more often do not. We need to apply ourselves to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I studied politics my entire life. I teach politics, but I've always dedicated my life to humanize politics as opposed to politicizing humanity. And I'm saying those things for the simple reason that Israelis and Palestinians have objectified themselves. They have pushed each other into a corner. And yes, there is a symmetry between them, but there is a time to say, we are neighbors forever. We come from similar backgrounds. We belong to the three monotheistic faiths, and these monotheistic faiths have things in common like compassion, justice, peace, healing the world, making the world a better place for our children and grandchildren. These are the values that we need our officials in Israel and in Palestine to start thinking about. There wouldn't be the attack on October 7th. There wouldn't be the war. I've accumulated, just to let you know, a list of all the wars that have been fought in Israel, Palestine, and I have given numbers to each of these in terms of dead and wounded. And I've come at the very end with about 90,000 dead among the Arabs since 48, 26,000 wounded. In Israel, we have over 20,000 dead and 50,000 wounded. What for? If they are so smart at engaging in conflict and fighting wars, why aren't they smart to engage in diplomacy, negotiation, and peace? So I'm a strong proponent, as Dr. Aronoff, for figuring out best ways that the loaf can be halved, the loaf can be shared, where these two entities, national communities, can figure out best ways to negotiate and create a two-state solution, figure out some modifications through a confederation whereby they can collaborate on issues of tourism, energy, security, education, and many, many other issues, including the issue of Jerusalem. And then they can live in peace, security, and prosperity. This is the dream I have. This is the dream that all Palestinian mothers and parents have. This is the dream that all Israeli mothers and parents have. And we owe it to our children and future generations to act on it as soon as possible and not to wait for another war and another war and another war. That's the way we should proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your moving and inspiring comments, Dr. Sarsar. I don't know, Ariana, whether you want to read us some. I was reading a couple, but also wanted to listen to my friend. So I don't know if you want to start us off with a question or two.
Yeah, I'll start with a common theme on which resources, be it books, literature, news source, what have you, would you recommend that is either unbiased or at least works along with the and rather than or theme?
Do you want to go first, or do
You go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Well, I think there are certain books and articles that one can turn to. So one that I think is very useful is Alan Dowdy's Israel-Palestine. I think it's in its 5th edition now, but it has Israeli narratives, Palestinian narratives, and then tries to go through conflict and efforts at negotiation in a balanced way throughout the book. So I would recommend that book. Another thing that I really like is Amos Oz's chapter called Right versus Right, and his little book called How to Cure a Fanatic. And that uses the kind of framework that Dr. Sarsar and I use, where he says it's not a movie that you watch to try to determine who's the good guy and who's the bad, but rather both are kind of refugee communities, both suffered under European colonialism, both were angered by Britain for different reasons and British rule, and both see each other sometimes in in vein of their former oppressors, and calls for a two-state solution. So I would recommend that. There's so many other books and articles, but I would also try to not rely on social media, and try to rely on different credible sources. And those might include things like the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, for instance. I know the MSU library has an English version of that. You might look at then different Israeli newspapers like Jerusalem Post or others. Like you might look at Israeli human rights group like B'Tselem for one thing. You might look at Israeli and Palestinian think tanks and Palestinian public opinion surveys, which I think are really, really helpful. You might also look at Al Jazeera, although knowing that they have biases in terms of being in Qatar that supports Hamas and so forth. You might look at a variety of think tanks, also Middle East think tanks in Washington, D.C., and a lot of academic sources that, at least, even though there's different perspectives among academics, that at least they've been vetted, they've gone through review, and they are more likely to have some credible evidence in them. And I would steer away from political advocacy groups and websites, which of course are going to be trying to promote a political agenda, as opposed to, and therefore selectively provide information, as opposed to trying to maneuver through the credibility. And of course, there are problems, as I was trying to read a couple questions with some of the news sources, like the New York Times, got it wrong on one of the hospital incidences and who was to blame, and later admitted to that. So certainly, no one source is infallible. But if you look at a variety of credible sources as well as academic sources, then you'd be better off. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm always asked the question, tell me one title so I could read and become all enlightened. I think that's maybe possible, but I agree with Yael that it's good to get introduced to Israeli literature, Palestinian literature, look at the biases in them, but then try to come up with ones that can join and add the end to it. A lot has been done about peacemaking from the top. I'm a proponent of also learning about peace building from the bottom, meaning that you look at institutions and organizations in Israel, Palestine that are working for peace. Just to name a couple of them, like there is Neve Shalom or Wahat Salam on the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. There is Hand in Hand in Jerusalem and other schools belonging to the Hand in Hand organization. There is organizations in Jerusalem focusing on that as well. So that's one. Another would be the Middle East Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you are a student and you are at MSU, please take courses with Dr. Yael Aronoff and others so that you can get introduced to a lot of these things. I'm not advertising my book or any of my books, but I wrote a whole book called Peace Building in Israeli-Palestinian Relations that uses a lot of this literature that highlights the need for the communities that are working from the bottom to lift up this peace process. And just let me add, beyond the question that you asked, just one quick statement that I think we need to synchronize the peacemaking with the peace building. These are existing at different levels. If peace is to really become fruitful, these two have to join together. So it's not enough for a president or a prime minister to sign an agreement. The issue is, how do we operationalize the agreement so everybody lives that agreement to the fullest? And that's a tall order. So we need to work harder on supporting peacemaking, but also supporting peace building and have them coordinate their efforts for the benefit of the communities.
Here's a two-parter question. So how can we retain hope in our current extremely divisive climate? How would we respond to this sort of divisiveness, either in the workplace or in class or business, in our place of business? Similarly, what's the best way to respond to the unbalanced, if not biased, teachings that come out of our major universities?
I don't know if you want to take that first or if you want me to take that first, Saliba.
Criticism is all around us in a certain sense, whether we live in the United States or we live in Israel-Palestine. And we just have to try and keep trying over and over again to say, to respond. Let's say you are in a class and a professor were to mention a statement or state something that is biased. It is good to either speak up right then and there, to ask a polite question, respectfully so, and to say, from what I've read in the New York Times, or I've read in the book by Khalidi, or by Edward Said, or by Amos Oz, this is not the case. In other words, if you do this respectfully, you can respond effectively to a professor or to a colleague, and to then indirectly or directly ask that, to say, we will have a polite conversation, and but I think in order for you to engage in this, question number one is really important. You need to be educated about those issues. But regardless whether we have all the knowledge or not, we need to disagree, but disagree agreeably, as opposed to start blaming the individual for the question or for the answer. And it's good to always ask good questions. To build on what Dr. Aronoff mentioned earlier, it's not either or, it's the and that is very important. Another one last point, and I'll let Dr. Yael add or subtract. We always think of perfect solutions, like let's have peace, or they are to blame for it, or it's their fault. Reality and life does not go this way. What I'm suggesting, when we discuss a conflict, it's important for us to know, where do we enter the conflict? Do we enter it, in the case of Israel-Palestine, 2,000 years ago, 140 years ago, in 1947, in 1967, or today? And that is important. So you need to create the parameters of the discussion. You need to really get to understand the context of the discussion, and then answer the question or engage in conversation that honors the other, as opposed to disempowering the other. So a professor or a colleague at work will respond if you were to be respectful. And if they are not, let them sleep on it. In 2-3 weeks from then, you can engage them again if you're interested. If not, you just let it be.
I would just add that, we're here to help students through how to think rather than what to think, right? So that's kind of a framework that is helpful, and we all have our biases, which is why we try to also provide different perspectives and encourage questions. And I think in any situations that the person asking the question put it in any of those scenarios. I agree with Dr. Sarsar that if you ask questions, right, then you can get at different assumptions and kind of get through kind of a discussion easier, perhaps. And if we have I think the framework of mutual respect and not attacking the person, giving people the benefit of the doubt, and trying not to necessarily label them, and try to have constructive conversations. I've talked to some students where things can be inflammatory, where maybe it's not always the right time to have a discussion, and maybe you just disengage because it's not the right time to have a constructive discussion. And often that's what we all want to try to have, especially at universities, to not kind of provide the truth and therefore also provide selective information for the truth, but rather look at multiple truths and try to help our students and ourselves go through the thinking process as opposed to telling people what to think. So those are just my 2 cents on that.
Just a quick addition. I'm a strong supporter of debate, but I'm going to distinguish here between debate and dialogue. In a debate, you present your viewpoint, the other side presents his or her viewpoint, and you come back with an award to say, I won the debate. If you go in a conversation with all the truth, capital T, and you are to prove your point and so on, this will not lead to a positive outcome. What we need to engage in more and more is dialogue, where you listen to the other, you respect, and you give room and space to the other to present their viewpoint. You withhold judgment and you listen, and then you can respond, and their obligation is to listen to you as well. And through this dialogue process, you can arrive at a higher understanding of the issues. And so I'm encouraging students, professors, guests who are professionals in other fields to practice the art of dialogue instead of just debating. There is a place for debate, but when we talk about Israel-Palestine and negotiation and so on, it's more and more important to engage in dialogue and do it respectfully.
The next question, or questions that'll group together, have to do with the role that the U.S. plays. An anonymous attendee asked, what do you think of Joe Biden's words said in 2014? If there were not an Israel, we would have to invent one to make sure our interests were preserved. How can we expect the U.S. to help the Palestinians and Israelis equally when leadership says this? Additionally, what can us Americans do to support peace in Israel-Palestine?
So maybe I'll start, and then Saliba can, Dr. Sarsar can also continue. So, I'm one that thinks that Jews have a right to self-determination and have one country in the world where you can express that through having a majority. And I'd want that within 67 borders with swaps and agreements on Jerusalem and refugees that would also allow self-determination for Palestinians. There's a right under international law, there's a right to self-determination for peoples, and I think both peoples have legitimacy to exercise that right. And of course, one could look critically at those things, and it doesn't mean that therefore one shouldn't, as the United States, sometimes provide carrots and sticks or incentives and other things for the parties to move in the desired direction. Also, in terms of the U.S., I mean, we haven't talked as much about this yet, but for Israel, it's not only kind of a concern with, particularly now with Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip, but rather you have in the region, if you look at kind of the US, you have, as Saliba also mentioned, some of these actors, you have Egypt and Jordan and Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and more Saudi Arabia that are kind of aligned with the United States in balancing the power of Iran and Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, and also seeks Israel's destruction, and has 120 to 170,000 missiles and gets support from Iran, as well as Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And you have the Houthis in Yemen also getting Iranian support that have also targeted Israel. So in terms of Israeli perspectives, they are still under threat, not only, on one border, but on several borders from groups that are getting aid from Iran, who also seeks its destruction. So I think part of the US's interests are informed by the balance of powers and regional rivalries and who it's aligned with in the region. In terms of part of the question, you have advantages and disadvantages to the fact that although many administrations since Reagan have also supported Palestinians and a Palestinian independence and provided, I think, at least $300 to $500 million often a year to the Palestinian Authority, that traditionally, I think the questioner is correct, that they have been stronger supporters of Israel. And so that's correct. And I think Dr. Sarsar mentioned this as well, that can impede sometimes on one's ability to be trusted by both sides as a mediator and facilitator. Another good book on this, by the way, is by Dan Kurtzer and Scott Lesensky on the American negotiating role. It's a wonderful book that critically looks at the US's mediation efforts over time and provides lessons and has the Clinton parameters in the back of it. So I would recommend that. We'll go back. So that's true, that if you're too strongly aligned with one party, that can impede your mediation efforts. It's also true, though, or can be true, that support can lend itself to getting Israel under certain governments to making the accommodations it would need to make in order to reach a two-state solution, while also the influence of regional actors like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and so forth in the UAE could help support and provide incentives also in the US as well for Palestinian parties to make accommodations to reach a two-state solution or a confederation based on a two-state solution. So sometimes you do need parties that you trust and that actually can make it easier for you to make accommodations. And I think that one last point is that often I think Israelis, not all, but many, are fearful of groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and therefore fear, what if there was a Palestinian state and Hamas took over? Would they do what they did on October 7th, right? And I personally feel those risks can be mitigated, and that's why things have to be negotiated so that Israel feels secure in it. But a lot of what motivates Israelis is fear of what would happen in terms of its security. And therefore, it is countries like the US who can alleviate some of those fears through measures. And and Palestinians also have fears and legitimate fears, and the US can also provide more incentives to them as well. And so I think that there are things that the US can learn from and do differently to become better mediators, but there's also advantages to including the US as well as other regional actors that could provide support and incentives to both parties to feel more secure and to be able to make the accommodations that will be necessary.
Yeah, it's a very good question, as the other questions are. The US is indispensable for mediating between Palestinians and Israelis. It behooves American leaders to show more even-handedness when you meet individually with American officials, they express that even-handedness far more readily than when they do it in public for some reason. Over the years, the U.S. has worked collaboratively with Israel, providing Israel with whatever it needs. They have reached out to the Palestinians, but there are restrictions in America as to how much the U.S. can do. But these need to be overcome. I wish the president, not necessarily President Biden, whoever is the president at the time, will reach out more seriously, not only to the government officials in the Middle East, like to Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders, but to the people themselves. Because here we have a disjunction between the official channels versus the popular channels, if you will. And there is a lot of disheartening feelings in the Middle East today that America is more pro-Israel than ever before. Witness the amount of support it has given since October 7th. That needs to be redressed, especially as Gaza war ends and there is reconstruction. The U.S. can play a pivotal role in engaging Arab countries and non-Arab countries to be part of that reconstruction of Gaza so that the people will benefit. But ultimately, when we talk about a two-state solution, it means that the United States and Israel have to accept the two-state solution, just as the Palestinians have to accept the state of Israel. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Israel recognizing the Palestinian people and statehood, and the Palestinians recognizing Israel and its independence and security and so on. It's a mutuality, and the U.S. can play that central role to push this forward. Now you can say, let the conflict end. I think, no, we have enough capabilities while the war is hopefully ending shortly. We need to start thinking of the day after. And I've hinted in my introductory remarks as to the need for the U.S. to play an important role in advancing peace in the Middle East by bringing both parties. And why not maybe in a future Israeli government, future Palestinian government, the president of the U.S. will invite them to Camp David, lock them into a room, and they cannot come out till they sign a peace accord. Let's try it and see what happens. But this is really needed. Let me just end to say, and I know you didn't ask that in the question, the people there deserve it. It's not proper for any leader to continue with current practices where people do not have dignity, do not have safe space, cannot actualize themselves. The Israeli people, the Palestinian people deserve it, and they deserve it now. As I mentioned to Professor Aronoff, I'm not interested in peace to come in 200 years or in 100 years. I want it in my lifetime, in my children's lifetime. The same for Israeli families, the same for Palestinian families. And that imbalance between Israeli and Palestinian society can be redressed with the U.S. filling in that void and enabling both national communities to come to yes once and for all. Obviously, we are highlighting the U.S., but European countries, Gulf countries, any other who wants to contribute to peace should be welcome to bring that over and make both communities live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity.
The next question is about language and terminology. Are the terms conflict and war the correct way to describe the ongoing situation? Along the lines of terminology used, how would you talk to someone that sees the events of October 7th as quote, legitimate resistance when you disagree?
Usually a conflict is a disagreement or antagonism between parties. And you could have conflict in your own family, in your own neighborhood, in your own state, in your own nation, in your own international system. Sometimes conflict gets resolved when there is obviously a reconsideration or agreement. Once we talk about war, war is more organized, violent confrontation, where you use armies, you use weaponry. The war causes death and destruction. That's at a different level. Now, every war must have a conflict, but not every conflict has war in it. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, a country has a right to defend itself, and unoccupied people have a right to resist. However, when the line is crossed, where innocent civilians are hurt, that stops being just resistance. That becomes terrorism. So terrorism inflicted on innocent non-combatants should not be tolerated. And that's why the October 7th events can be termed terrorism versus just national resistance. There is non-violent resistance, which is accepted internationally, and Palestinians throughout the years have participated in some form of that type of resistance. But once they start hurting innocent civilians, that oversteps the bounds. The same with Israelis. Once Israeli settlers or others attack innocent civilians, that is not acceptable. And so that's how I distinguish between those types of words and those types of events.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I would just add that, 2/3 of Palestinians, even in the Gaza Strip, survey after survey shows do not support Hamas. So if you look at the previous wars of 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, you'd have about 30% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip supporting Hamas before the war. It would go up sometimes 2 or 3% during the war, and then within a year afterwards, it would almost essentially go back to what it was the year before. So first, we want to understand that you can support Palestinian statehood and Palestinian self-determination, and simultaneously criticize Hamas's terrorism on October 7th. And also, when we look at resist, sometimes I think to myself, okay, what was Hamas resisting on October 7th? And you might say it's conditions in the Gaza Strip, and you might say that Israel contributed to it, and then go back to when Israel, if Hamas wasn't strengthening its military capacity to attack Israeli civilians, then the conditions, you go back and forth into what causes the conditions and the multiple things that contribute to really disheartening conditions in the Gaza Strip. But it seems like the timing of what Hamas did was to resist Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia, that Iran and it opposes, resist then what it may have meant for strengthening the Palestinian Fatah party of the Palestinian Authority, that would have been strengthened by that process and would have been the main interlocutor that might have made progress towards a two-state solution. And what it is resisting is any Israeli presence, even within the 67 borders. It is resisting a two-state solution, wanting to destroy Israel and replace Israel with one Palestinian state. So what it's resisting is Palestinian independence and part of the land as opposed to all of the land. And so that's, I think that Hamas, certainly the methods it's used were contemptible on October 7th, and I won't get into the nitty-gritty of how brutal it was. But but certainly they're also resisting the framework that Dr. Sarsar and I have been using throughout this webinar.
Why, in your opinion, is the two-state solution superior to the idea of a one-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side under one government? Why persist in pursuing a two-state solution?
I don't know if you want to go first or if you want me to go first, Saliba.
Yeah, I already explained part of this by saying that this is the way to bring about a resolution to the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. I've looked at multiple plans. I've looked at 12 confederation plans. I believe the two-state solution is the way to proceed and move forward. I want to alert you to a book that is called What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. It's by a friend of mine, a colleague. His name is Hussein Ibish. And in it, he details the many factors that why a two-state solution is the way to go, or to say differently, what's the problem with the one-state agenda? And he, if you'll allow me just for a minute, he says things like, the creation of a single Palestinian-Israeli state is not possible given existing international and regional power equations. That's one, because all countries in the world agree with a two-state solution. One-state rhetoric lets Israel off the hook on occupation and settlements. That's the second. Number three, the single-state agenda has no significant political base among Israelis and Palestinians. Maybe it has some at some point, but on the whole, if you consider both societies, it does not have that support. The single-state agenda has no basis in international law, which strongly favors two states. One-state rhetoric harms the Palestinian national interest. So there are multiple reasons. Now, if we agree with the one-state solution, it means Israel will be dissolved, Palestine will be dissolved, there will be one. And the Israeli society, majority of Israeli society, the Israeli leadership will never accept this. Now you say, should that then discourage us? Again, I'm not interested in a one-state solution that will be developed in 100 or 200 years. I want to address the issue of equality, of symmetry. And I think just as Israel was created in 1948, and the commitment was to create an Arab state of Palestine, that will be the just thing to do, which is to create a state for the Palestinian people adjacent to the state of Israel on the lines of 1967, with the proper swaps and negotiations for any difference on that, create a highway or highways between the West Bank and Israel, have East Jerusalem be the capital of the state of Palestine, just like Israel is the capital, Jerusalem is the capital on the west side, the West Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. This all can be worked out. I advance, in addition to the two-state solution, the issue of confederation. And for that, I have the other book, which I helped to work on, called the Holy Land Confederation, as a facilitator for a two-state solution. The implication there is that if these two states are side by side in an area no larger than New Jersey, they have so many things in common, so many issues to be resolved. Why not attempt to work them together and figure out best ways to collaborate, or to what we call cohabitate? Now, in the state that we have today, where there is national trauma, hopelessness. Who wants to cohabitate with the other? But if we think beyond war, beyond the trauma, into the future in terms of a decade span, this is very possible, and we need to work on it. When we passed this idea by people in Congress, by people at the White House, by the United Nations officials, all of them tend to favor something like this. At least they never were critical of it. They didn't say no. And there is some hope there. So there needs to be reformulation in Israel-Palestine along the lines of saying, we are neighbors, we want to work on this issue. And very important one word, and I'll stop, the issue of intention, the concept of intention. They need to have the intention for peace. It's not enough to talk about it for the next election. It is a conviction within the mind and the heart meeting together to say, enough is enough. We owe it to our children. We have the positive intention to negotiate until we reach an agreement. If you were to talk to Israeli officials and so on, they will say, we negotiate over everything. The Palestinians are ready to negotiate over everything. Most Palestinians will recognize Israel tomorrow if there is that reciprocity. So we need all of this to be worked on, and I strongly believe that the two-state is the way to go that will address the immediate concerns of both national communities.
I fully agree, and I'll just quickly add that we've also had, extensive negotiations over years as to what a two-state solution would look like. And I remember years ago when I was in Jerusalem, Saeb Erekat and Shlomo Ben Ami, who were both negotiators at Camp David in 2000, said, we're basically done with negotiations. We know what a two-state solution looks like. We just need the leaders to be able to take the initiative with mediation to make this possible. So we basically have had thousands of hours and thousands of documents detailing what a two-state solution would look like. We've had zero negotiations or official negotiations on what a one-state would look like. And if it's hard enough to agree on how self-determination by both peoples would be exercised, it might be even harder to agree on power sharing in one state where probably one party over time would not be able to exercise that self-determination. And you could even see it in many examples of civil wars in one states where that was tried as well. So, and we have the Arab League supporting that as well. I see that time is coming up. I feel we wanted to make some remarks at the end, so I feel bad that I see there are 48 questions and there's no way we could get to all of them, but we really appreciate the interest and engagement. And also for those of you who are at MSU, you can always come by my office or email me, and I'm happy to talk if you'd like to talk further as well. And Professor Sarsar is extremely busy doing many things, but he might offer to communicate with a couple people, but he has time limits, especially over the past few weeks. It's been overwhelming. So I know I want to leave some time for Dr. Sarsar to make some final remarks, and I would just like to remark that we really appreciate all of you, some of you who have stuck with us for an hour and a half when it's been exhausting and it's these difficult issues that we're talking about. But this also brings me hope, and I think we have to remain optimistic because I think that Israelis and Palestinians do want peace. And even though we're in the most painful period in many years for both Israelis and Palestinians, and our heart goes out to Israelis and Palestinians, that there are so many people who can work towards creating the conditions for peace. Saliba Sarsar has worked on, I think, 150 organizations peace-building organizations of Israelis and Palestinians. There are many people working together. In fact, within Israel, Bedouin Muslims and Muslim and Christian Palestinians or Israeli citizens have at large been helping each other in different degrees and working together in many ways, and not to idealize it, but have continued work together. And there's so many opportunities. We hear about the painstaking war now and the painful situation in both societies, but there are so many good-hearted people who want peace and just are disillusioned by some of what they see among their compatriots. And I think with strong mediation, as Dr. Sarsar says, a lot can be done there. And I'm just hoping, I guess I'll end with this, and before I give to Dr. Sarsar, that I know I also brought to campus virtually two representatives and former leaders of the Parent Circle. That's one of the peace-building groups that Dr. Sarsar talks about in his book. And they're a group of 600 bereaved Palestinian and Israeli families who have lost close family members to the conflict. Unfortunately, those future members could grow. But we had one who lost his 10-year-old daughter to an Israeli border police person, and one who lost his 14-year-old daughter to a suicide bomber in Jerusalem. And they both have been working together for years. They call each other brother and sister. They send, this group sends often their kids to common summer camps. They go to Israeli and Palestinian schools and try to fight dehumanization and demonization of one side by the other. And I always think, especially when we see increased polarization on different college campuses and increased tensions and increased calls for maximalist, as Dr. Sarsar said, views, that we have to continually be inspired by people like members of the Parent Circle who are living there, who have made the deepest sacrifices that ever can be made by losing a child, and that continue to fight dehumanization together and to really have close relationships and become good friends. So those are the people that I think we look to for inspiration. And if they can do that, then I think certainly we can do that on college campuses as well. Dr. Sarsar.
Let me just conclude. I'm reading from my one of my books, just a couple of short paragraphs. True peace comes to us when we prepare for it. Our children deserve a better tomorrow than today or yesterday. If peace does not embrace us, who or what will embrace us? If not now, when? It is time that each of us contribute to the mosaic that is the Holy Land, that is peace. If we do so with faith, hope, and resilience, then we will be the better for it. Ultimately, our collective action will imbue the Holy Land and beyond with care and compassion and set the dove of peace free. That is the dream, and that is the vision we seek. That is the soul and spirit of the Holy Land, of Palestine, of Eretz Israel. Shalom, salam, peace. And I would like to just end with a short poem. As Dr. Aronoff knows that most of my presentations end with poems. This poem, some of you might have heard before. It's called When Peace Becomes the Holy Land. On bright sky, a rainbow lights, a graceful dove finds home, olive leaves stretch from the hand when peace comes to the Holy Land. Glistening hopes from elders east blend with Western nations, fear and sin melt beneath the sand when peace unites the Holy Land. A shrine, red petal adorned, holds forth its walls' bright sound, where hymns foretold of sages grand when peace restores the Holy Land. Then laughter the children raise midst bells and trumpet blare. Love reigns, such sweet demand when peace flows from the Holy Land. No idle dream or empty words, nor deeds will break the spell, for now we must firmly stand for peace, peace, peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Sarsar, and thank you, Ariana.